My choice is made. I'll roam through the world, living just like a vagabond, to rescue my poor neighbor. Could I see my dear brother's soul perishing everywhere through sin, my heart not being touched? No. No, Lord, no. No, his soul is too dear. Could I see his exquisite soul fall into hell forever, yet not one person distressed? What? Could I see God's loving blood poured out for us all and wasted? My brother's ransom for eternity lost? I would rather be damned. Oh Lord, everyone blasphemes you by blaspheming your own image. Should I bear this without a word? Your foes now ravish your glory. Should I cowardly take their side? Truly, Lord, I would rather die. Lord, I will be victorious. Almighty God, give me your arms to conquer the world with its charms, and all things against your law. To convert souls, O Lord, bestow your holiness into my soul, the truth into my mind, and pure fire in my heart. Grant me the gift of wisdom and of fervent charity, creating a godlike man. Great God, make my voice thunder so evil may be destroyed, and your holy will be done on earth and in heaven. All I do, Lord, is for you. You alone are my concern. You with no human respect. I stomp on the world and its show. If, Lord, my zeal pleases you, I will count myself as blessed to become the world's trash. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death.
Mary, Queen of all hearts,
pray for us.
Saint Louis Marie de Montfort,
Pray for us.
in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Those were the first several verses of hymn number 22, the resolutions of a zealous missionary. They're powerful and a bit even disturbing in the sheer strength and forcefulness of that. It very much is a cry from the heart of Father de Montfort, who cuts a compelling figure, but also a challenging and at times disturbing one. In fact, on the occasion of his canonization in 1947, there was an article that was written in a French newspaper celebrating the new French saint, but making an important observation that there are two kinds of saints. One is that saint whose face is comforting and reassuring. That saint whose holy presence is gentle and uplifting. That one upon whom our eyes fall and we cannot help but love. And the article said, earlier this century, just a few decades ago, one such saint was canonized. It was Therese, the little flower. The church looks at her and cannot help but fall in love with her. This gentle example of goodness and holiness. And then the article says, and then there's the second kind of saint, whose face is not so comforting, whose example is not so reassuring, and who comes to us like a torrent of water flooding down a mountain recklessly. The saint that is canonized this week, it says, is such a saint. And his name is Louis Marie Grignon de Montfort. Rough, off-putting, uncompromising, relentless. As challenging as he is appealing, difficult to understand, difficult to follow, and yet in his own way, absolutely compelling. Louis Marie Grignon de Montfort. And so it is important, having spent these days reflecting on his spirituality, we must take some time reflecting on the man. On the man. And over the years, there have been various ways of engaging the life of our founder. From the very beginning, shortly after he died, there were attempts made to summarize, to understand, and to interpret his life. And the early biographies of our founder are a real treasure and an important resource. Not simply for our own personal edification, but also for the formation of our candidates. Shortly after Father de Montfort died, a biography, Father de Montfort passed away in 1760. Already 7 years later, the first thorough biography of Father de Montfort goes to print. And it was put together by the Abbé Joseph Grandet, an older French cleric who had dedicated himself to writing the lives of holy French priests of the 17th century. This was Abbé Grandet's last work before he died. He passed away just a few short months after this work was published. While he was working on that biography of Father de Montfort, as he was looking for background information, he made inquiries to those who knew or worked with Louis Grignon. And he asked if they would be able to share some of what they knew with him. One of the sources that Abbé Grandet uses is information, material that was written down by a French priest who spent 8 years working at the side of Father de Montfort. One of the other people he approached for information was a friend, a childhood friend of Father de Montfort, Father Jean-Baptiste Blaine. Father Blaine grew up with Louis de Montfort, went to seminary with him, knew him well. Father Blaine's manuscript didn't arrive until just after Father Grandet's book went to print. And so Father Blaine wrote his summary of the life of Louis de Montfort roughly around the year 1724. It was never published until the early 1900s. In the 1920s, in one of our French journals for members of the association, the biography of Jean-Baptiste Blaine was published in excerpts over several months. And so this tremendous and important resource wasn't available really to anyone until 200 years after it was written. In addition to these two very early works, a more thorough, longer biography was produced approximately around the year 1777 by Father Bernard, who was the third superior general of the Montfortian communities, after Father Malot and Father Audubon. And Father Bernard was very, very thorough in his approach. We know he was still working on the biography in the 1770s. And so the exact date he finished, we don't know. We do know that a biography of Louis de Montfort was published in 1785 by another priest, and what was published was effectively Father Bernard's work with a couple editorial changes. And so we can safely date the biography to 1785. These early biographies, these early treatments of our founder's life are remarkable and important. Father Paul Allerton of our British province has done the congregation a very good service in making translations of these biographies available. For those who would like, I have copies of the PDF files with me. And so I have the Blaine biography, the Grandet biography. The Bernard biography is 2 volumes We only have an English translation of the first volume, but I do have that with me. Okay? So I will happily pass this material on. A few words about these early sources. One of the modern criticisms of them is that they were written to edify the reader. In other words, they were written to give us reasons to admire St. Louis de Montfort. That is an empty criticism. Show me a biography of St. Louis de Montfort that has been written without wanting us to admire Father de Montfort. I would prefer it being obvious to me than hidden under a scholarship which claims not to be doing that. And the modern biographies of Father de Montfort all do it in different ways. But when we title our books, Montfort, a Prophet for Our Times, what are we saying? Look at him, admire him, and draw spiritual lessons from him. When our biographies are written from the perspective, Montfort, man of the streets, united with the poor, we're taking a certain perspective that we admire and applying it to our founder. So some of the modern criticism that these early biographies do a little too much cheerleading is a bit out of balance. Do they do perhaps a little too much cheerleading? Yes, they do. But it's clear. Sometimes in our modern approach, we're doing the same thing. We are just not as capable of seeing it. And now for formation purposes, isn't that why we ask our young men and women to study the life of our founder? Because there are virtues that we do admire and we want to imitate. Because he had a way of preaching that had a method to it that was successful. And we want to learn it. This is one of the reasons the early biographies are important. Father Grandet's biography, after he goes through, and there are historical inaccuracies in the biography, something written that close to his death is going to be inaccurate in some places. You don't have all of the reliable memories, all the reliable information coming in. But what he does have is marvelous first-hand testimony. He interviewed people who saw Father de Montfort, who experienced him. And so when we read this biography or Father Blaine's biography, however inaccurate the chronology of some of the details in our founder's life are, the first-person accounts of this is the look in his eye when he spoke to me. This is what it was like to hear him speak. Those are invaluable. They're irreplaceable. And Father Grandet, at the end of his presentation of our founder's life, precisely because he's writing to edify us, does something many biographies written later do not do. He says, these were the great virtues that St. Louis de Montfort practiced. And then he lists them and discusses them. One might question the accuracy of some of his discussion, but the fact that he presents them for us to consider and think about is incredibly helpful. And then following that, he says, and these were the things he did in his ministry that made him effective. Again, while one might question some of the accuracy, the fact that a presentation exists is incredibly useful and helpful. If nothing else, it is tremendous material for his successors to look at, to consider, to discuss, and to say, is there perhaps something here that we can learn? Is there perhaps something here that we can do ourselves? Or is there perhaps here a mistake that we would be careful to avoid? All of these are useful and helpful ways of framing it. And so when there is a biography that's written saying he is in fact a holy man, and are there eccentricities in behavior in his example that are difficult to understand? Yes. But in the middle of that, can we see how his holiness comes to bold and effective missionary expression? The same way, Father Blaine recounts incidences from the youth of Father de Montfort that we're not going to have from any other source. One of those incidences that he recounts is something that cuts to the heart of Father de Montfort's vocation. When Father de Montfort was in the seminary in France, the New World was being colonized, especially by the British and the French. And the stories were coming back into Paris from the first Jesuits who had gone to the New World. And they had gone over into Canada and the central part of what is now the United States. They'd gotten on the boats. They left from the seminaries in Paris where the students were studying. And there was incredible fascination of these bold apostolic men cutting this heroic figure, leaving their homeland to go to this unknown territory, taking the gospel and needing to translate it into who knows what language the native peoples are speaking, not knowing what is waiting for them. And so all these ideas of the missionaries going out into the wilderness. And as a young seminarian, Louis de Montfort was as captivated by those stories as everybody else. This idea of a new world filled with souls who had not heard the gospel filled his mind, and he wanted to go. He wanted to get on one of those ships and go to the New World. He knew he had a missionary vocation, and he had this stirring within him. And his superiors discouraged him and did not aid him in this endeavor. And Father Blaine says, and later in life I asked the Superior Saint-Sulpice why this was. And Father Lachassier told me very directly, because young Louis had such an overwhelming zeal, he would be reckless. And he would have run into the wilderness chasing the natives, and he would have gotten lost and never found again. This fire in his heart he was not able to master yet. What a marvelous window into our founder's personality. This young man bursting with missionary vigor that he can't get control. Ready to explode to preach the gospel, but also needing to be tempered. Needing to be slowed down a bit so that the zeal and the vigor would have productive manifestation. And so that being the case, I really do strongly advocate taking some time with the early biographies. The Blaine biography is very short. One can read it in a matter of an hour or two. It's not that long at all. And again, are all of the details of his life in the correct order? No. Are there some factual mistakes? Yes. But is there an irreplaceable snapshot in a number of locations of just who our founder really is? Oh yeah. And it's different reading them in the words of Father Blaine than somebody else's summary later on. The same thing with Abbé Grandet. Material that is summarized later on, he simply lays out in front of us as it was given to him. And so there are first-person testimonies in some of the letters he cites that are invaluable. In fact, in God Alone, the collection of letters and some of the other miscellaneous writings of St. Louis de Montfort, these are our sources. We don't have the actual physical letters. Father Grandet had a copy, and he wrote it down. And so these elements that we have in God Alone often come to us from the hands of the early biographers. The same way, Father Baynard, because of his authority and his status and time, he was able to have access to information about Father de Montfort's time in seminary that his previous biographers did not have. When we look at our founder and we study our spirituality, it's important to always keep a couple things in mind. the spirituality of St. Louis de Montfort is not generic Catholic spirituality put together by somebody who said, let me think in general about being Catholic, let me think in general about prayer, and let me put together a good general framework. Spirituality doesn't come into existence that way. This is the expression of the lived spirituality of a man with a missionary vocation. And so the spirituality has an intrinsic missionary thrust to it. Does it mean that everyone who practices it suddenly becomes a missionary? No. But it is expressive of a missionary vocation. And this is important for us who are missionary religious in his tradition. It is not that our missionary vocation and our spirituality stand side by side and we move with one or the other. They're a piece. They're a piece. Father de Montfort's spirituality and his missionary vocation are not separate things. His spirituality animates and sustains the vocation. His vocation is how the spirituality develops, where it develops. Just like in our own lives, if we reflect on our own religious life. How we live our vocation shapes our prayer, doesn't it? And our prayer shapes how we live our vocation. The same way here. This is one of the reasons why the study of our spirituality is so important. It relates to our charism. It's not an extra thing alongside the charism. You know, to say that the Montfortian charism involves the renewal of the church by means of a devotion to Our Lady, that comes right out of the spirituality of our founder. It's not something that simply stands alongside. And this is why, then, the study of the spirituality and the study of Father de Montfort's life need to be a piece. Sometimes what happens is we study his life without reading his works. We study his life without reflecting on his spirituality. And so we miss something important in the biography. He is a spiritual man from beginning to end. And his vision of God and his relationship with God shapes his life from his childhood to his death. Without engaging his spirituality, he can't be understood. He can be admired, he can be looked at, he can be studied, but he can't be understood. And using the word that we've been hammering the last couple sessions, this idea of incarnational, let's take some time today and look at the effect of the mystery of the Incarnation on the life of Louis de Montfort. To say not simply that his spirituality is incarnational, but there is an incarnational aspect to his living, to his mission work, to his preaching. And what would that mean? That being the case, I'm going to propose that we keep in the back of our minds a scripture verse that is seldom used when we discuss the lives of the saints, but one I think that is very important for Father de Montfort and his spirituality and his life. And that is from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 10, verse 8. And I'm not going to put anybody on the spot and say, what does St. Matthew say in verse 8? This scene in Matthew's Gospel is where Jesus is sending out his disciples 2 by 2, giving them the mission to go and take the gospel to the lost sheep of Israel. Now, if we pay attention to that hymn we just began with, you can hear in this hymn this burning desire to seek out the lost and fallen away. And so Jesus now is sending his disciples to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. This is their first missionary movement. And as the Lord is giving them instructions, don't take a walking stick, but do this, don't do that. In the middle of those instructions is this one statement by the Lord, which can be translated various ways. Freely you have received, freely you are to give. Without cost, you have received. Without cost, you are to give. Or as a Spanish translation that I ran into recently says, generously you have received, generously you are to give. And let's linger with that last idea. What does it mean to receive generously? Isn't that an odd statement? We normally think of generosity as being on the side of the giver, not on the side of the receiver. What does it mean to receive generously? It means to throw your life open to the one you're receiving. It means to offer yourself, to open yourself widely to what you are given and to whom it is that is giving it to you. What a remarkable image that is. And if we go back to our original discussion of Christian life, the greatness of Christian life that Father de Montfort insisted on, sharing the life of Jesus, generously you receive, throwing open the doors of the heart to fully receive what it is that God is giving us. Why? So that what we receive, we can give. And so the life that receives generously is the life that will give generously. The life that receives freely, not just without paying up a financial sum, but in freedom, without fear of being disappointed. That one who receives freely, in that same freedom of receiving, should turn around and do that giving. And I would make a strong case, I think, that if we really look at Father de Montfort's life, we see this principle articulated from beginning to end. So now let's have a closer look at our founder. And if we peer into the mystery of the Incarnation following his lead from his writings and from his life, there are a number of virtues that we can identify in this mystery of Jesus becoming flesh for our salvation. The first and greatest of those virtues is humility. In fact, in one of his methods of saying the rosary, this is the virtue that he associates with the Incarnation. A profound humility. But related to that humility is the virtue which is the fruit of humility, obedience. The proud cannot obey. The proud can grudgingly comply, but the proud cannot truly obey. Because obedience requires a submission of the will. Next, liberality. From Scripture. The Lord Jesus makes himself poor so that we might become rich. Why does he come into the world? To save us by giving, by pouring out his life for us. If that is not the very essence of liberality, of generosity, I don't know what is. The Incarnation is redemptive. And so again, from Father de Montfort's writings, especially as he so strongly and beautifully asserts in the love of eternal wisdom, the Incarnation is the necessary beginning of the road to the cross. And the pathway that the Incarnation marks out is the way of the cross. It leads there. And so again, when we look through Father de Montfort's letters, how often does he say, I am seeking the cross? And then finally, why does the Word become flesh as well? To seek out and to save all of those who are lost. So Father de Montfort, peering into this mystery, doesn't just contemplate the marvelous union of divine and human in an abstract way here. He doesn't focus on just a narrow intimacy between Jesus and Mary. He's conscious of all of these things. But he sees something else. He sees this vigor of the apostolic life of Jesus Christ in this mystery. And all of these things we see in his life, don't we? This curious relentlessness, this single-minded focus, this humility, this obedience, this willingness to lay all other things aside for the sake of what is truly important. And now, in the background, in 17th century France, before Father de Montfort was born, and then after he's born, while he's growing up, popularly among the clergy, the theologians, spiritual writers, there is an idea. It's an old idea, but it was current in France at that time. And this idea is something we don't speak about regularly today, but again, for us, it is important. The origin of preaching and the origin of missionary life was seen to be in the Trinity. In the eternal going forth from the Father of his word. And so theologians like Pierre de Bérulle would contemplate the Trinity. And they would see the second person of the Trinity as one who is always receiving life from the Father, always going forth from the heart of the Father, always expressing the goodness, the love of the Father. What a remarkable understanding of the second person of the Trinity.